The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
What was the first podcast that you did?
The first podcast that I did for myself. Oh, God. Here comes the skeleton straight away. Thanks, Matt.
We got to get rid of the dead bodies first before we can get down to the logistics of everything.
I'll get arrested before the end of the recording. Oh, my God. Okay, so there was a show I did in, like, what was it, 2012, like, first proper show. Avoiding all the, like, I'll do 6 episodes and see how it goes through Spreaker. The first proper show that I went all in with, probably one in 2007, actually, which was the Neil Veglio show. Oh my God, how bad was my strategy? And then 2012, a show called Chaos and Theory, which was basically the Neil Veglio show, but even worse title.
And in 2007, I mean, that was the time when we started to upload these things to iTunes, right?
That's right. Yeah. There was no Apple Podcast back then. All iTunes, all iPodder, all cables connecting your MP3 player.
But the roots of your audio experience goes right back to radio, though, right?
That's where I learned my trade, absolutely. Small radio stations in the mid-90s, and then sort of moved to London kind of 1999, 2000, got gigs on national radio stations, and then, yeah, kind of survived about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's no big deal. No. I was on national radio, things like Capital Radio. Yeah, not a big deal.
Well, my bank balance at the time would have agreed with you.
But was radio your first audio love?
Believe it or not, no. No, it wasn't. My first audio love was actually music. I was one of the sort of kids that was messing around with samplers, home computers, taking, dance records and sampling bits of it and then sticking it in, on a floppy disk and playing around. And yeah, that was my first love. I mean, I'd grown up with a guy called Kenny Everett when I was a kid. My mum and dad used to watch the television show that he had, but I was more interested in his radio stuff. And he was on Capital Radio when I was about 7 or 8. And so, but I never imagined in a million years that I would ever be working in radio. I thought for me, the best outlet is music. And so that's kind of what I went into. But as I got older, I realized actually this radio thing, it's just really talking to a microphone. I can probably do that. And then I just started practicing. And yeah, for sure. Like when I turned kind of, around 13 or 14, there was a local radio station called Radio Cracker, which was a charity station for kids charities. And they had a local outlet in my town of Didcot. And they were looking for volunteer presenters. And I went down there, and it was what we call an RSL, restricted service license. So 30 days on air, local transmitter. And I had 30 days of basically playing late night shock jock. Essentially, all my callers were just other kids calling up and, doing armpit farts, and thinking it was hilarious. But I was like, I love this. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And then, yeah, I cue work experience, cue college, cue first gig in tiny radio station in the middle of the woods somewhere. And that's, yeah, went all in from music to exclusively radio at that point.
So what music did you enjoy and like? It must have been the early 90s, mid-90s?
I mean, I started falling in love with music in the mid-80s, actually. So I always remember my dad, one Christmas, his friend used to bootleg old cassettes for me of people like Paul Hardcastle. So very synthesizer, Axel F., Harold Faltermeyer, all of his stuff. And that was my introduction. Lamal, Kajagoogoo, Spandau Ballet, all that kind of stuff. And then as I got slightly older, of course, you can't listen to that music when you're a teenager. So it became, all about the dance music, Euro dance, trance, the rave era and all that. But I mean, if I was to show you my currently non-existent CD collection because it's all been burned to streaming now, hasn't it? But, you know, if I were to show you my Spotify playlist, you'd be like, what is this guy on? I mean, there's everything from Pavarotti through to Prodigy through to Rage Against the Machine on there. So music overall, which I think helped the radio career, because unlike some that get really attached, I mean, one of my best friends is still in radio. She works on a station called Absolute, which is we play real music station, in like a rock station. Whereas I didn't have that attachment to any particular styles. I was, you know, happy playing pop, happy playing 80s, happy playing 90s. So yeah, that kind of helped, I think.
When did you identify that podcast was a thing? And by a thing, in air quotes, I'm going to say that you could make money from it.
Oh, make money from it. That wasn't until much more recently, actually. It's always been something I treated very much as a hobby or a marketing tool for my radio career, honestly. You know, I've been dabbling with audio in the sort of what we would now call the podcasting space since 2000. I mean, that's the history, really quickly. How I discovered podcasting as we now know it. I used to have a radio show online. A guy called Bruno Brooks, who was our version of, I guess you guys get Rick D's where you are, or got Rick D's. He was the UK version of that. So top 40, Sunday afternoons, 4 till 7, counting down the hits. And he ended up becoming my boss because he heard me on a radio show and took me on for this pioneering digital station, as it was at the time. And it was just on the internet and also on local DAB radio as we have it over here. And I got a bit greedy with my audience because I was doing the 2 till 6 show, and I realized actually there's a huge contingent of potential audience that aren't hearing me. You know, people on the West Coast that are probably driving into work, they can't hear the end of my, you know, my show ended like 10 a.m. West Coast time, Pacific time, to use its correct vernacular. So I was like, what can I do to get those people listening? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my show, rip out all the ads, keep the music in at the time because we didn't know. Big no-no now. But I thought, you know, if I get like 20 people listening, then that's great. And literally it crashed the servers. And that's when I thought, okay, there are hundreds of thousands of people trying to download this. All the IP, getting all the IP numbers coming in. It's like, there's something to this. And that was when I thought, well, I can use this for my radio career. You know, if people can't hear me because they're in Scotland or Ireland or Australia, America, this is an opportunity for me to put this audio online where they can, at the time, right-click Save As, the MP3 file. And then, of course, we were blessed with podcast hosting and RSS, and the rest is history. But yeah, certainly used it as a kind of like a bolt-on marketing platform until around 2016, when things like Patreon suddenly became on my horizon, and dabbled with that.
I love the term, and it comes from your part of the world, called catch-up radio.
Yes. Our mutual friend James Cridland can be credited with pretty much inventing that, actually. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I've been listening to catch-up radio for years, and I love it. In fact, I think I saw some data at some point that said it was really eating up most of the evening listening, and overnight listening was more durable for radio than evening listening, because, you know, we can put ourselves to sleep with any podcast, any catch-up radio, any book, anything really.
Absolutely. And the really the interesting thing actually is, from your point of view, how I'm aware of people like yourself. And of course, you know, people like yourself are legends to me, because I've been listening to you since the early 2000s, thanks to Catch Up Radio. And Neil Rogers, who was a guy out of Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, talk show host, afternoons, very angry man, used to just rip on his station bosses, and that's what made him brilliant. And I was listening to him online since 1997, like Web 1.0, back when people were making websites out of, you know, GeoCities and things like that, you know, like free comes in a box kind of websites. And that guy was streaming his daily show, and that's how I used to listen to him. And so, yeah, absolutely. Catch Up Radio is something that you guys have had in the bag for decades. But yeah, like I say, James Cridland kind of made Virgin Radio at the time start getting into it, and that's how it became kind of mainstream in the UK a little bit later on.
I do have a story from about 2008 when I had a morning show as a program director. And, you know, what do program directors say the most? They always say, oh, can we shorten that down? Can we cut that down? And I remember inside the catch-up radio, I said, maybe we should take out some of this other stuff. And I shortened it so much that people were actually downloading the show, but they knew where in the show they could find the parts they like. This is well before chapter markers, of course, came in. But when I shortened it, I got complaints. And I was like, oh, that was a bad idea. And so the next day we put it back to the way it was supposed to be, where people could find, because they like the feature at 8:15 or they like the feature at 9 o'clock and whatever it was. So it's not good to mess with the listener's cheese. Who moved my cheese, as the book was titled.
Absolutely. And that's something that we have leaned into, isn't it, as podcast people, where, that whole thing of like, oh, I can just plug my microphone in and just talk for 20 minutes and then upload that. And it's, no, you need to give the listeners something to lean into. They need to, they set their routines by it. Even podcasts, you'll get people that go, oh, it's Tuesday morning, therefore the social media marketing podcast is out today. I'll click that. And then if it's not the show they're expecting, maybe it's a bonus or a guest or something like that, they freak out. And so, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of learnings from that experience.
So I knew Neil Rogers, by the way, because I would spend time in Florida. It was WQAM 560
yes.
with the blah blah. But for whatever reason, he was able to just, I mean, what is Florida full of, especially near Miami? It's all full of old, cranky people. And yeah, that's what the show was. And I used to see on the message boards, they would talk about him all the time.
He was a legend. I mean, I still now, to this day, I know we'll probably touch on this a little bit later on. You're probably going to curse me for saying this, but YouTube, the really useful thing about YouTube is that people can archive their old podcasts, obviously, on there. And so I'll be spending regularly, I'll be spending a good hour or two just boring my wife by watching, listening to, with pictures, old Neil Rogers prank calls and, parody ads and all that sort of stuff. It's just, yeah, anybody that hasn't listened to Neil Rogers, you do not know what you're missing out on. God rest his soul.
You touched on marketing earlier. I did a show to market myself, but still to this day, so many people want to rush in and do a podcast and say, I want to monetize, I want to make money. And I'm like, well, how do you know you're not? By doing the show. It's a form of marketing. What if you just took the money from your marketing budget and paid for the podcast and look at it that way instead of some sort of direct revenue generator in terms of money? I still think that's the greatest power that podcasting has.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, when I get clients that come to me and say, Neil, I want to do a podcast, but how do I get sponsorship and advertising? That for me is a red flag straight away, because it's not that we can't help them to do that, but it's definitely not the way that we'd recommend it. Because let's think about it. When you're starting a podcast from scratch, you haven't earned the right to sell to them yet. It's like the analogy I use is, imagine you go to a networking event and nobody knows who you are and you start yelling marketing messages at all these people that you don't even know yet, versus if you've been going there for 6 months and they know who you are. If someone then suddenly presents a problem to you and you say, oh, I can solve this problem, suddenly it's less icky. And so I always say to people, look, you can monetize it in other ways. You just need the attribution. You just need to know that what you're doing is in some way contributing to your bottom line. But of course, people don't think that way. They don't think, well, actually, if I just share this specific version of my podcast link in this particular way, I can then see exactly who's come in from that method, rather than my newsletter or my website or whatever. But I find people aren't really that excited by the notion of having something that they're creating that doesn't actually give them that vanity metric of revenue straight off the bat. And they definitely want that first and foremost. But yeah, it can be frustrating, but we certainly, as podcast agency, we do say, we're only really going to focus on using what you're putting out there as a marketing platform for selling you, not treating the podcast itself as a product.
Yeah, and you also monetize an audience and not a podcast, and you haven't started the podcast and you have no audience.
Absolutely. And you won't get an audience if the first thing that you're doing is selling to them. That's the thing. I mean, it's one of the most off-putting things. If ever I hear a new podcast, and I love the idea of the content, but the first thing I've got to deal with is 90 seconds of pre-roll. I'm out. I'm just, to me, it's like, number one, it's boring, especially if I can't skip it because I'm doing something else at the time. Number two, it just really tells me what your show's about. You're not looking to necessarily add value. This, to you, is a means to an end of fluffing up your bottom line. And so, I will spend, here's a real life story for you. I literally became a Patreon subscriber to Pod News today, having listened to it for 5 years or however long it's been going. Because it's just like, it came up, God, of course I want to subscribe to this because James does a great job. And the same with Pod News Weekly Review, doing the Buzzsprout subscription and all the other shows that I listen to. But it's not an immediate thing that I'll do on day one. And so building that relationship is really important. I'll tolerate as many ads as you want to throw at me, providing I'm already sold on what you're selling me.
I think there's a lot of things that happen in podcasting because Joe Rogan does it or other popular people do it because he said the first thing, all the ads up front. But that's what Joe Rogan does. And everyone copies that. They put episode numbers in the title because Joe Rogan does it. Right? And somebody asked me yesterday in a forum and said, should we have episode artwork? And I'm like, I guess, yeah, why wouldn't you? Why are you asking this question? People are actually looking for data on this stuff. But then somebody ran numbers and said, well, the top 20, only a few have episode artwork. So this copying from above seems to be a recipe for disaster.
And not only that, without wishing to be, who am I trying to kid? I always want to be controversial, and I will be happily controversial right now for you. What you also have to bear in mind is that those at the top are not necessarily getting real reflections of their organic audience anyway. Many of them are paying to be there, whether that's through, dodgy bot downloads or, in engagement pods. Podcasting obviously has its own version of engagement pods, whether it's, a marketing agency that's spending so much money behind the scenes on, inflating their traffic, to get them in the charts or whatever it is that they're doing. Just because a show is in the top 10 on what Apple are calling a chart doesn't necessarily mean that they are really following best practices. The best practices that you want to be looking at are those shows that maybe are a little bit more mid-range because the chances are they're more authentic. They're probably doing it the right way. They're probably a true reflection of, there's nothing wrong with paying for audience. I mean, it's one of the services that we provide. We provide that service to our clients of, if you want a guaranteed minimum, we'll get you that guaranteed minimum and we'll do it legitimately and authentically so that you can use it for, sponsorship, advertising, lead generation, whatever you want to do. But most shows at the top are not doing it for legitimate reasons. They're doing it because they want attention. They want to be able to go to conferences and sell that. So, yeah, for me, it's like, engage your brain and do a little bit of deeper thinking on this. Why are these shows at the top of the charts? And if those shows at the top of the charts don't necessarily pay attention to what they're doing, pay attention to what your competitors, other people in your space, if you've got a show about finance, look at other finance shows and see when are they releasing? What are they doing with their artwork? What are they doing with their titles? Because the chances are what they're doing is working. So that's probably a better practice to follow than what Joe Rogan, who's guaranteed 1 million listeners every week anyway, no matter what he does, are doing.
There's so many different ways to count in this space. And you sort of reminded me of the time I think this podcast went to #1 in Nigeria.
Yay! Well done.
Yeah. I released the episode on a Sunday. The show's about radio, and who has iPhones in Apple Podcasts in Nigeria? Predominantly radio people who are going to listen to the episode. There's not very many of them. And so, yeah, I'm probably for one day going to beat the moth. And I did in Nigeria. And, I thought, because I really need to look at that and think, how's this sort of added up and how do they count this anyway?
Well, also, the different countries are weighted, aren't they? So, for example, it's much easier. And I've got a good example of this, actually, a show that we made called Life in Barbados. It was a travel agent, and she spent a year living in Barbados. That was a premise, that we had this travel agent who wanted to, it was during COVID era, so she had nothing to lose. She took on one of these special passports that they were giving away at the time, where you live in Barbados for a year and they would give you a grant to move there, etc. So she did it, and she made a podcast around it. And we got to number one in the Barbados chart for, I would say, about 3 months. In fact, it's still in search rankings, still the number one podcast that shows up above the official Barbados Tourist Board show as well. But if we were to do a show about life in the UK, or life in the US, or life in New York, life in Los Angeles, life in, Quebec, life in Vancouver, the chances are we wouldn't get even close to the top 50 with that, because the charts are weighted according to how popular the shows in that country are. The fewer shows you've got being pushed into categories, the fewer competition you've got, and therefore it's much easier to chart. So Nigeria, certainly, I think Mexico as well, are probably two of the shows where if you really want the vanity metrics of charting, you probably spend a couple of £100 on promoting an episode in those countries, and then you'll probably get there quite quickly.
There are podcasters listening going, well, what are the metrics I need to pay attention to then?
Listening time, really, isn't it? I mean, Dan Meisner is, one of our peers, and I'm a big fan of what Dan comes up with. He's a very smart guy. He's been, in this industry a long time as well, and he's nailed it. I don't think he's particularly popular with a lot of podcast hosting companies right now, because he's essentially calling it how it is, that, your download numbers, they're nice. They give you a kind of idea of, where you are in general in terms of how the show's performing. They're a nice 90-day metric. This is what I was doing 90 days ago. This is what I'm doing now. I can now plan based on that trajectory what I might be doing in 90 days from now. Here's what I need to do to achieve that. But they're only ever going to tell you how many people have literally downloaded the episode, whether it's automatically or physically. Doesn't tell you how long they've listened, so it doesn't tell you whether they've listened. So for me, I think that's certainly where I've been steering is, when I've got clients that get excited because they've got 1,000 downloads on their episode, I'm like, great, but let's have a look at your Apple Podcast retention data. Let's have a look at your Spotify data. And just, it's that whole thing when you look at YouTube, isn't it? Oh, 900 views. Yeah, 790 of them stopped watching after a minute. And that for me is kind of, it's indicative of where this is all going. It's going to very soon separate the podcast agencies that are selling downloads with fake bots versus those that go, you know what, like yourself, we've got to sit down, we've got to strategize this, we've got to know that what the audience is looking for is getting catered for, and that we're engaging them, we're keeping them on the hook for the whole of the episode duration. That's what really matters.
Tell me why someone should not buy from a podcast promoter. What do they explain to them? Because I know there's people like, maybe I should do this. Now talk them off the ledge. Go.
Don't do it. Come back. It's not worth it. Okay, now I'll go into a bit more detail. So it's risk. You're literally risking everything. You're risking reputation. We know. Let's not beat around the bush here. If you have paid to get your show that no one has ever heard of, to be mixing it with the likes of Stephen Bartlett in the UK and Joe Rogan in the US, we know how you've done it. It's certainly not because overnight you became a huge household name and everyone wanted to download what you're talking about. It's simply not the case. So reputationally, not just people inside the industry like ourselves, but pretty much everybody. But also the apps themselves, the platforms themselves. You know, I had it under good authority. An ex-member of staff at Apple Podcasts in the UK, I won't name her because I wouldn't want to throw her under the bus, but she did confirm to me that they do have a special database where all it takes is click a button in their spreadsheet, untick it, and suddenly your show does not show up in search anymore. And the reason they're doing it's brand protection. Apple Podcasts are not there to serve you. They're there to serve their audience. And so the audience is the most important thing for them and what the audience sees. Now, if the audience is seeing a bunch of shows that are taking up space in the top 10s of all the categories that A, have clunky artwork, doesn't look good, B, sounds terrible, and C, is clearly not worthy of being there, that's harming Apple Podcasts' brand image. They are not going to take that risk. They would rather upset you and risk you boycotting them as a platform, in which case, great, we didn't want you anyway, because you're the sort of cheat that tries to game our algorithms. It's just not. And also, you're not going to get any results from it, because if you're getting 1,000 downloads that are coming from complete bots that don't exist, number one, it signals to the platforms, well, this show's getting a lot of downloads, but no one's listening to anything. It must be really bad. And therefore, you destroy your growth anyway. So that short spike of adrenaline and dopamine that you'll get from seeing your show in a chart for 3 days, because that's how long it will last, no matter how much you throw at it in terms of marketing budget, if that's what you want, go for it. But your show is never going to succeed after it. Believe me on that.
I'm surprised a lot of people don't equate the fraud, because a lot of people will screenshot that. Then they're going to go sell ads with it. And they're essentially, that's fraud right there. And it's the only check they're going to get, because their cash register is not going to ring at the other end. And the thing that really bothers me is that that's what that business or that industry thinks of podcast advertising going forward, when we know it's not true. Makes me crazy.
Quite. I agree 100%. And I had this conversation with somebody, actually, that, you know, why is it not that, I mean, they can tell when this is being done within the platforms. So why they don't put some quite clear language on the website, on the app, wherever they need to. Certainly on Podcast Connect, there's plenty of opportunity to put something on Apple, Apple Podcast Connect. If you do this, this is what will happen to your show. I don't understand why they don't do that. But then I kind of do, because actually, while people are talking about gaming the algorithms and the charts, it's getting people obsessed with something that they want to gamify. That then Apple, same with LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the same. LinkedIn constantly being criticized for not doing anything about engagement pods. There's something like 150,000 different accounts on LinkedIn that are gaming the algorithm. They're joining these engagement pods. And people say, well, why don't LinkedIn just ban them? Kick off the account? Because it's good for LinkedIn. It gets people talking about LinkedIn. It gets people using LinkedIn. So why would they cut the nose to, why would they bite the hand that pays their bills? And I think that's what it comes down to.
I think with Apple, they started booting some podcasts in 2018 for a number of reasons. Keyword stuffing was one, and for, alleged promoters being another. And I think it probably clogged up the help email and the support staff. I mean, it's a waste of time for them.
Yeah.
So I think the solution is, as you mentioned earlier, just uncheck the box, and now nobody can find you. So much easier.
I mean, it is really silly that, the amount of shows where they do this, and then, there was a time when I used to take note of these shows because I thought, well, that's interesting. This guy clearly doesn't deserve to be here. He's obviously a business coach that's trying to game the platform for, self-serving reasons. And so I would take a note of them. And at one point I was keeping a spreadsheet of all these shows because I wanted to see what happened to them. And honestly, I actually, about 3 months after I started this, I got round to finally checking on some of them. I think one of the something like 20 shows that I'd noted was still on the platform. So that gives you an indication of just how hot on this Apple Podcasts are now, that only one show, so 19 shows, got booted for spending 3 days in the top 50.
You mentioned we can track consumption on Apple and Spotify. What is the number you're looking for where you're happy, where you think, yeah, this is working really well?
It depends on the show, honestly. I mean, if it's a show where there's a specific business reason attached to it, then I would always say, well, you probably want to be aiming for about 80% retention minimum, because you got call to actions in there. If people aren't hearing your call to actions, what's the most popular call to action? Is your mid-roll. So if your mid-roll is showing up somewhere around halfway, or maybe 20 minutes into a 30-minute episode, then people need to hear that to make it worth your while doing the show. But if it's just a brand awareness thing, or a vanity thing, or for credibility, which most people, the most hilarious reason I get given, Matt, honestly, the altruistic, oh well, I just want to give value. Okay, then it doesn't matter if people don't listen for more than 2 minutes then, right? Oh, no. I want people listening to the whole episode. Right. So you're not interested in giving value. What you're actually interested in is getting ROI, making the readies, but you don't want to be honest about it. Well, that's fair enough. It doesn't matter what your reason is. But yeah, if you're doing it for vanity metrics, it doesn't really matter. Just putting something out there already makes, puts you in a top 5% of the population, because 95% of the population are not doing, contrary to there's 4.5 million podcasts. Yeah, right. You know what I mean? Yeah, right. So you're already ahead of most of the planet in terms of doing it. So even 90 seconds of content being consumed is better than most of your competitors. But, if you really want results from it, then you look to be shooting about 80% minimum. And if you're getting 50% or lower, quick tip for you, shorten your episodes. Really easy, quick fix.
Just by releasing an episode, you can be a top 5% podcaster, according to Listen Notes, because you immediately defeated all the dead podcasts out there.
I don't know. I think Listen Notes actually still counts a lot of dead podcasts. It's not very difficult to make it to top 1% podcast, according to them.
Yeah. So let's go from one sort of like small piece of fraud to an even bigger one, and that's YouTube. We'll talk about the promotion side in just a sec, but a lot of people do wrestle with, and I did find that at the podcast show in London, there were a lot of people talking about video, gotta have video. And I'm like, oh God, do I really have to have video? I mean, who's going to find you and me talking to each other with big microphones and headphones interesting? Like, who's going to watch this? Because I put this up all the time. A few people watch it. They watch it for a few seconds. I think they actually go and run to listen to the better audio experience, which is a little more edited and, shaped for ears and sound design. So do you think the rush to video is overhyped? Is there something you can tell incoming creators and bring them down to earth?
There's two separate questions here, isn't it? I mean, if you're asking the question, is video overhyped, then the answer to that is, categorically, yes, it is, massively. And there's always going to be a reason for that. It's equally valid to have a video version of your podcast as it is to decide not to have a video and just go audio only. 100% equally valid. That said, it is another opportunity for you to reach people in a destination that they're hanging out in. My take on it is that there's a whole section of the population of a certain age that don't know how to find Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, Pocket Casts, and other of the 500 apps that are out there, but they know where YouTube is on their TV.
I'm sorry, are we talking about my kids or my parents?
Yeah, both. Funnily enough, we're the awkward middle. And that's the really interesting part here, is that kids and the elderly know what YouTube is, but they don't necessarily know. I mean, kids, yes, they probably know what Apple Podcasts is because their friends have probably told them about it. Chances are they'll know Spotify better because only weird middle-aged people use Apple Podcasts these days. and people that are gaming systems. So for me, it's a case of my mum is in her mid-70s. She's never going to listen to me on Apple Podcasts. She wouldn't even know how to get it on her phone, especially now she's gone back to Android again. So that's try getting someone with an Android phone downloading a podcast app. It's next to impossible, certainly since we've lost Google Podcasts and Stitcher. Those were kind of the go-to, weren't they? So I get your take on the whole, well, I'm putting this out there and my podcast, my audio podcast might be getting, I don't know, 100 to 500 to 1,000 downloads if I'm lucky. And you go into the Connect dashboard and you see the retention is like 80%. Great. Brilliant. Winning. Video, not so much. But the point is, I think like I just touched on with podcasters, where we don't necessarily automatically know how to optimize our content for search, it's the same with YouTube. And I've recently learned that the difference between getting 10 views on your video and 1,000 views on your video is literally taking the time to properly metadata, and sticking the right things in there. A common mistake that a lot of podcasters make that mean that their show doesn't work is they will take the same title that they've put up for their podcast in whatever their podcast hosting platform is. They'll put the same title in YouTube, and that will never work. Just because the different ways that people engage with content on YouTube is vastly different from the ways that people are used to seeing their content fed up to them in podcast apps. So that's the first thing. And also, in a lot of cases, it'll usually be episode 101 talking about marketing.mp4. That ain't getting found. And sadly, YouTube does look at the original file name as well as what you put in the title field.
Okay. Do you have an episode on this that I missed?
Not yet.
Okay.
So there's a bit of imposter syndrome you've touched up on here, Matt, because I do not present myself as a YouTube podcasting expert at all. Certainly not. However, for my own purposes and for my clients, I have been doing a lot of research into this recently. So all this kind of stuff is like hot on my learning list. I call it a learning list. I go through phases where I want to really nail down, 1 minute it's Google ads, the next minute it's Meta ads, next minute it's in-app advertising, all that stuff. Right now, I'm all about YouTube. So I'm learning a lot. But honestly, there's actually, if I may promote another podcast, there is an episode, and you can delete this if you want to afterwards, not a problem. Dave Jackson, the School of Podcasting, his latest episode, as we're recording this, is with a guy who is literally, he's a novelist. He's literally interviewed this guy about how to use YouTube. And he doesn't touch on what I've just talked about, but he touches on a lot of the other stuff around properly planning your thumbnails and properly planning for the YouTube audience. So that is a recommended listen, because I think the guy's onto something there.
Yeah, you'll find it in the show notes of this episode if you're listening to this now. So that's fascinating. And you mentioned about the title not matching necessarily what you put out on audio. And immediately now my heart sinks a little bit, because that makes trying to track data for how episode performance goes harder. I'm like, how are we going to link it together so we can count the people? Right?
Explain that to me differently.
Well, if I title this one way on my RSS feed and another way in YouTube, and I've built a tool perhaps to count the listeners or aggregate the number of people, how am I going to join that together?
I'm with you. So which works best, basically? How do you track which is the most effective? That's the difficulty here. And that's really why, it takes the effort. And that's what separates the people that want to do this seriously from the people that just want a passive income structure in place. And, honestly, it's for me, the best practices around YouTube, I think what I've learned is that you really, if you want to do YouTube, then you have to think about it as two separate products. You have to think about the audio podcast version is using the same source material, of course. I'm not suggesting you re-record the whole thing again just for audio or re-record the whole thing again just for video. But you have to bear in mind that they are at their core, two different products. And it might be that you have to record a special intro and outro for the audio version that doesn't get included in the video version. But certainly it's almost a case of, what artwork do I use for the audio version? What artwork do I use for the video version? And I certainly have leaned in recently to this idea of having two very different versions of the artwork and A/B testing them, because that's a thing. You can certainly do that. And after a while, I think you get an idea for what works in general. But of course, like Dave's guest says, in podcast, the difference between podcasting and YouTubing is that podcasting is a long, slow game. You need a lot of consistency and a lot of episodes till you finally start to build that traction and get that regular audience. Video is the opposite. You can have 100 videos that do nothing, then suddenly one cracks and goes viral, and that is your show taken care of for the rest of its life.
So let me just dovetail a little bit over to the fraud side of YouTube, because I think it's a little more rampant over there. And you can get me 1,000, you can buy 1,000 subscribers, which can enter you into monetization. It feels a little bit dicey. I mean, listen, I've seen some shows and they're saying that I've got 1,500 subscribers. And the first thing I'm like, well, who'd you pay to get that? Because this is about basket weaving.
Speak for yourself. I love shows about basket weaving. Very relaxing.
Yeah. But is it? It's a different game over there, isn't it? I mean, what are we even counting? Because we don't even know what the plays are, or what constitutes a view.
I personally think it's the same game. Honestly, I think what we're looking at here is, so yeah, you can get 1,000 subscribers. I believe that half opens you up to monetization. I think you still need 4,000 hours of watch time. So your 1,000 subscribers are going to do nothing for you if nobody's watching. But on top of that, what you have to remember, like with gaming, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, it doesn't matter how many subscribers you've got. If no one's watching, you're not making any money. No, YouTube are not going to pay you for 3 views, even if you've got 10,000 subscribers. So, and they know, they absolutely know. If you've bought bots to follow you, they know, they can just tell by the activity. You put a video out, 7 hours later, 9 people have watched it. Hang on a minute, this guy's got 50,000 subscribers. How's that happened? Oh, because they're not real. Therefore, we deplatform them. And it's, yeah, I think the bottom line is, you're talking about fraud. Fraud is a big fraud nearly sent me around the bend last year. Like, it's a very British slang term, but it nearly sent me into burnout last year, because I spent so long fretting about all these people that were gaming algorithms and gaming the system. And, why should Stephen Bartlett be famous when we all know he was gaming the Apple podcast charts back in 2019 after spending 3 years talking to himself with 9 listeners? But the thing is, these people only thrive on the surface level. There's no competition for you. If you're doing it the right way, the only thing you should ever care about is what your bank balance tells you. And if your bank balance is telling you, yes, I can afford to live this week. Yes, I can afford to take a nice holiday. Yes, I can afford to do all the things that I really want to do. But you've got 20 downloads in your episode showing. That's great. It's a fantastic conversion rate. You should be proud. You should be proud of yourself. And that's the unsexy part of this. I did this talk at the podcast show where I talked about how my own show only has about 50 downloads per episode on average. I mean, I get some that do really, last couple of weeks have been viral, 2,000 downloads, but it's what I'm selling from those shows that make me live the life I want to live. And so if I'm looking at my podcast stats and going 30 downloads this week, oh, woe is me. But then I look at my Calendly and I see how many people have booked podcast audits with me that are going to help me to eat next month. That's all I care about.
Yeah, it doesn't make your cash register ring.
Absolutely.
What do you make of Spotify's move to video? And I'll rephrase it as a client this time and say, Neil, I'd really like to start uploading my video to Spotify. Good idea or bad idea?
Terrible idea. Terrible idea.
Okay, good meeting. Thanks.
I would refuse to work with you, Matt. No chance at all. No, I'm kidding. Ethics aside of, I, like you, I'm very protective of, my birthright. the RSS feed, it's something I fell in love with in the early days, even back to the days when I had to code the damn things myself, using a very outdated article where someone taught me how to code them. Might have even been James Cridland. I can't remember, to be honest, but there was definitely a really helpful website I used to use to code RSS feeds. Then, of course, the podcast hosts like Libsyn came along and made that easy for you for an exchange for a few nice little pieces of candy every month. But the protection of RSS aside, which Spotify is definitely not trying to do, it's trying to do the opposite. It's not going to help you get audience, because everything Spotify does, and it's the same with any platform, it's the same thing LinkedIn does, it's the same thing YouTube does. To a certain extent, it's the same thing Apple Podcasts does. Everything that Spotify in particular does, though, is geared towards the 9 or 10 people that can really benefit from these tools. Everyone else is literally volume of, well, it's commodity. It's a commodity for shareholders. If we can get everyone trying to put their videos on Spotify, great. We can report to our shareholders, wow, video hosting has taken off. We've had 1 million people upload their video and give us free content that we don't need to pay for. Isn't that fantastic? Plus, they can't monetize that because we literally rip the video and rehost it. That's why, you really want to think about whether the decisions you take with your podcast are in your own interests or in the interests of the platform. Nothing free is really free. We know this. If it's free,
just a tip: if they send you an email and say, "Check out this new thing we're offering," probably not about you; it's about them.
Ask some questions. And you know what? A really great tip for this is, if you ever get an email from a platform or a provider of any sort, and you think, is this really as altruistic as they're making out? Are they really giving me a great deal here? Stick it in ChatGPT and ask it to assess the terms and conditions of the platform to let you know what the black flags are. It will very quickly tell you.
I'm writing that one down. That's a good one. Yeah. Spotify, by the way, for those who are listening, the difference between us uploading a video and just, sticking with the RSS feed and listening the way you normally do would be the ads. You're not going to hear the ads or the promotion from the people who support us. You'll get a blank mid-roll. You won't even get a mid-roll. You'll just get this video that just goes on. And it will be a video experience with audio in your ears. And am I daft to think that all of a sudden one day Spotify users are going to go, well, I'm going to watch. I'm not going to listen to this anymore. I can't wait to watch because I didn't have to mow the lawn or walk the dog or do the laundry. Absolutely. I'm just going to watch these two guys with their big headphones on and their giant microphones. Yeah, that's where it's at, baby.
I'm starting to get the impression, Matt, that you don't think that looking at us is a particularly engaging thing to do. I think we're beautiful men, honestly, for our ages.
Well, the numbers don't reflect that if you look down below here.
It's all right. I'm going to buy you a bunch of bot views. You'll be laughing.
Yeah. Listen, I have had people say, I asked somebody once, I said, do you listen to podcasts? And they said, yeah, I listen to Dax, or I watch Dax Shepard on YouTube. And I go, why? You can just listen. And they don't know any differently, or that's just the way they do it. I had one guest here on the show say, yeah, I love watching the show. And I go, why? Listen, you want to listen to the show. I spend all this time, sound design and making it boom, bang, exciting, great microphones. I didn't even bother to shave or get dressed for this.
Appreciate the effort.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah.
What were your big takeaways, by the way, from the podcast show in London?
Big takeaways. Oh, I love that question.
Like when you're traveling back, you probably took the train. I did
indeed. Yeah. Overpriced and standing room only, but I did take it. Absolutely. Honestly, aside, of course, from meeting you, which was a definite highlight, having this voice come up behind me while I was waiting in the queue for the Pod News Weekly Review recording, hearing, hi, Neil, and then not recognizing you straight away because you're much more handsome in real life, of course.
Yes.
But meeting you and your lovely wife, of course, that was a real highlight. And yeah, that for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that it is a small industry. It's a cottage industry still. I don't know how. I mean, the speculation of around 5,000 to 6,000 people across the weekend. If you take it like James Cridland said, if you divide that by 2 for all the people that went both days, even 2,500, 3,000 people. That's how many people are in this industry essentially. By other industry standards, that's tiny. But I worked in radio. You worked in radio. I'm going to ask you a question now, Matt. I'm going to put you on the spot. When you worked in radio, when you were in broadcasting, did you ever feel lifted by the enthusiasm and energy and collaborative opportunities of your competition?
No, I spent most of my day trying to piss them off.
Exactly.
No, I look for passive-aggressive ways to upset their day. Often I would write letters to them and tell them that the show was fantastic, knowing full well that the show wasn't fantastic. I just wanted them to keep it on the air for another few months so that we would have somebody to beat up on. Often the wrong caller would call the radio station and say, did I win? And they were listening to the wrong station. I said, yes, you did. You've won $1,000. Come down and pick up your prize.
Love it.
And they'd go to the wrong radio station and nobody could figure out what was going on. Yeah, just these arsehole things that you think up to do stuff. Yeah. But yeah, to that. And like every conference, for instance, is not like it was where we're all going to come together. It was one company goes one way, another company goes another way. And everyone talks about all the secrets in the business. I go, what secrets are you talking about? They're in a 60-second promo. And they're being broadcast over the air. So yeah, it's a nutty industry. But I understand the competition when it comes to radio because you're up against what is happening now. And in podcasting, it's not like that. It's on demand, right? And so when people think, well, what is on demand? I said, well, what is the biggest competition for Netflix? And it's not Amazon, and it's not anything like that. It's sleep, right? And when you're doing a podcast, it's up against all this shit you got to do in the day, and the baby crying in the car and the kids and the go here, go there, work and boss. That's what you're up against in the on-demand world. So the rising tide lifts all boats in this business. And in radio, if they had and still have time to do this, they will fix a lot of their problems. I
100% agree. And, for me, what was really telling was whenever we went to award shows in the radio industry, certainly in the UK, we had, the Archivas, the Sodis before that, the Radio Academy Awards. I mean, James Cridland will tell you all about these, the amount of people where you would see their little radio stations around their little round tables of 9 people, and they'd keep themselves. And next to that, you'd have the rival radio station, and they would be shooting bad looks at each other. And it's like, guys, the champagne's flowing. There's a live music act on stage. Just let it go for like an hour, please. But, there was absolutely an intensity about you'd go visit a radio station and eyes would be following you as you went up the corridor through the sales office. Like, who is this person? Can they take my job? And I love that podcasting does not have that. I think I probably met about 30 competitors, which, what we would call competitors if we were going to go down that road at the podcast show. And the fact that we were able to have conversations where, oh, how did you achieve that? Oh, I'll tell you exactly how I achieved it. How did you achieve that? Oh, yeah, let me tell you about that. It's just fabulous. And I think that, and the fact that one of the things that I learned during the Advice Lab sessions that I tabled, most podcasters do not know how to name their shows. Like, we joked about it right at the beginning of this. Like, my first show, the Neil Veglio show, then Chaos and Theory. I had another show that I did a little bit later on, which, what was that called? The Unbeatable Show, because I was on a radio station called The Beat at the time. And so we had The Unbeatable Show. So terrible names, but people are doing that all the time, not just individuals, but brands. I spoke to a Christian broadcast network based out of London they had ex-BBC people that knew radio like the back of their hand, but they didn't know what this podcasting stuff was. And when they told me the name of their show, well, first of all, the name of their show, which I forget now, and I wouldn't want to shame them, but it didn't sound anything like you would search for in any podcast app. And also the show artwork was just two random blobs. It told you nothing. So I think it's really easy for us to think, oh, well, everyone knows best practices now. What can we offer? What can we really do to help people? We absolutely can do things to help people. And, you know, the likes of Mark Maron, who's just announced that, you know, WTF is coming off in the fall. Well, there are going to be 20,000 new WTF-style shows that are now going to emerge and try and fill that void. And what they're going to call it? WTF. Biggest mistake.
And that sort of dovetails a little bit into something else that's important, that a lot of people don't have websites. So if you're going to call a show something, at least give it a fighting chance to have something that's, you know, going to have an address on the internet. You can put a little SEO to tell people what your poorly named podcast is all about. Like, get the website. Like, I would just tell people you got to get the website before you think about getting into video.
I would 100% agree with that. And it's you know, people saying, oh, well, you know, videos are no longer a luxury. They're a must have. I would say, actually, no, the website is the must have. 1,000%, because, you know, number one, it eradicates that awkward thing that every podcaster get my show wherever you find your podcasts. No, do not. No, send them to, you know, the Sound Off podcast. You've got your website. Absolutely. You know, that's what you need to do. For that reason alone, that will help your podcast infinitesimally, if that's a word. But more than that, absolutely. You know, Google, certainly now with, you know, with the rise of GEO, for anybody that doesn't know what that is, that's generative engine optimization, which is your chatbots, essentially. The amount of people I'm now hearing where podcasts are being recommended by ChatGPT and Claude, it's insane. And the only way they can do that is if you have a website. They're using YouTube to a certain extent as a backup. So you'll certainly, if you're on YouTube, again, another reason why, you know, rewinding, I don't know if you want to branch this into the earlier bit where we're talking about YouTube, but if, you know, another good reason to use YouTube for a podcast is obviously the GEO, the Chat GPT, Claude, and all the chatbots are now indexing YouTube videos. But aside from that, back to the other bit, aside from, you know, the benefits of having that, you know, that ability to get YouTube indexed in your chatbot, it's also the website is going to be where you're going to host those videos that are getting indexed by ChatGPT. So what better way to have more collective data together that it can easily find and recommend other episodes as well as the person searching. So, you know, there's so many benefits going forward to future-proof your podcast, aside from the traditional ones like SEO, ease of, you know, directing traffic where you want it to go, to your newsletter or wherever, or to your Patreon. It's a no-brainer. You need a website, 100%, especially as most podcast hosts now give you one for free.
So this podcast is called the Sound Off Podcast, and I was listening to your recent episode, which talked about titling your show, and I've tinkered a little bit with how to rename it, and there's nothing really I can really go to because it's just been so entrenched with an audience. I thought, do we call this a Sound Off show? We could change it a different way, but I've already got other things that I branded off that, including the Sounding Off newsletter, soundoff.network. I'm far too deep into this now to be changing the title. So, and I think there's enough data out there in the search world that people can find me, thankfully.
You don't need to change it, but I would argue you might want to adapt it. You're looking at me like, what is he?
Well, if I say how, do I have to pay?
No, not at all. I'll give you this
Okay.
absolutely for free. It's what I tell everybody. So, you know, yeah, by all means, the Sound Off. So the way I tell people to look at this is treat your title almost like a cinema, like a movie title. So you get Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning. You get Star Wars, Attack of the Clones. You know, Jack Reacher, episode about whatever. It's the same idea. So you've got your brand is the Sound Off podcast, but then who are we for?
The show about podcast and broadcast.
Yeah. I mean, ordinarily I'd say never use the word podcast in your title, because then what you're automatically doing is benching yourself against, I think it's something at this point like 50,000 other titles that have all got podcast in there. But certainly when it's a qualification thing, yeah, absolutely. You know, a show about marketing with audio, a show about podcast marketing, a show about radio and podcasting, any of those things. You don't even have to say a show about, because in my view, that's probably wasted mileage. I would probably say podcasting and radio.
Unfiltered, real talk.
You got me. I'm sold.
Some of the most overused podcast titles that are out there. Let's just dive right into
Unleashed.
That pool. Yeah. Unleashed. Yeah. Which actually reminds me, who do you say no to? When somebody comes to you with an idea for a show, who do you say no to?
Egos. People that are not doing the show for any good reason other than bragging rights. I have a podcast. Look, here's my podcast. It's in the charts. You know, it's funny, the amount of business coaches that I've actually had to turn down because it's really obvious to me that they've got no interest at all in the medium and they're just looking to flatter their own egos. I got no problem with people doing a show for, vanity metrics or, for their own, to their own end. No problem, but do it in your own time. I'm not here to help those people. The people I'm here to help are those that frankly have a gift. This is going to sound really holier than thou, but it's true. People that have got a gift or can move others forward in some way whereby they're willing to exchange that information and that content in return for either more profile or money. It's really as simple as that. If you're going to come to me and you're going to say, Neil, I want a top 5% podcast. I want to be in the top of the Apple podcast charts, every single week. Let me recommend 3 other people to you that will work with you. And it's happened more than a few times, I can tell you that.
When somebody wants to get a podcast audit with you, what does it entail? What can we expect back from your findings?
Good Lord, I need to pay you a marketing budget here, don't I? You're selling my services better than I can.
Well, I think even if somebody doesn't go to make the purchase here, at least they're going to have an idea of what an audit is all about.
Let me give you the blueprint. It's really simple. Anybody can do their own audit, honestly. I mean, you certainly, I'm sure you do yourself, and I do my own audits now and again as well, with cobbler's shoes, all that stuff. But
yeah, Valerie Geller calls it the self-check.
Absolutely. And that's essentially what, my audit is doing that for you, really. It's like when you go to any marketing agency, what they're going to do is they're going to go about, right, well, what car do they drive? What golf clubs do they go to and all that sort of stuff. And that does nothing in terms of your growth. It will give you, a nice little avatar that you can put a picture on the wall and talk to them during your sales conversations. It's not going to put money in your bank. What's going to put money in your bank is getting results from the podcast by improving it, by making sure that the thing you're putting out into the world is packaged correctly. And the way that we do that is, first of all, we've got to have a listen with critical ear. The biggest recommendation I ever give to anybody that does their own podcast and doesn't work with a producer is this, right? The best favor you can do yourself if you're DIYing this, go back to an older episode that's at least 2 months old, okay? Listen to it and take notes. What do you love? What do you dislike? What would you do differently? What other ideas have surfaced for you that you would have added in if you'd been given the chance to hear it in the past? Time travel. That's going to give you an idea of exactly where your show is now, potentially. Okay. The reason we do it like this is because when you're publishing episodes that are quite recent, you're still in creator mode. Your brain is listening to it for all the things that don't make that much of a difference, really. In terms, well, they make a difference for me because as someone that wants to produce quality content, I want to make sure that it sounds good, the breaths are reduced, there's no clipped edits, there's no mistakes, the music doesn't drown out the audio, all that stuff. That's the technical stuff that we all do when we're in creator mode. What we're not necessarily listening to is what's being said, the conversations, the way the dialogue's happening, the chemistry between the host and the guest, the questions and the topics that are emerging, whether or not the correct follow-ups were happening, or whether or not, you know, a good indication of whether someone's actively listened or not is whether they've picked up on something that the guest has said and then gone down a different path versus reading what's next on their script. Those things you will pick up on when you're listening to an older episode because you've forgotten it. You've forgotten the process of creating it. So that's what we're doing. First of all, we're listening to the audio and how it sounds. Then we're looking at the packaging. So what does the artwork look like? What are the episodes called? How are the descriptions written? What are some of the things that you're discussing in the episodes themselves in terms of pillar content? You know, can the search engines easily find this stuff if they're looking for this stuff? And contrary to popular belief, and certain people at certain podcast hosting companies say that no descriptions get indexed, well, I can say categorically they do, but your show has to be at a certain level before that starts happening. Sorry, Rob Walsh at Libsyn. I have said something that's really going to annoy him, but that is true. And I've done tests on this to prove that as well. So it's really about making sure that all your SEO's nailed, your audio's nailed, your opportunity to be found is nailed, but also what are you doing versus your competition? You know, do you have a closely competing podcast that sounds better than you? Or does it sound worse than you? Great. You can tick or you can cross either way. It's just things like that. And also how it's showing up in Google, how it's showing up in the podcast apps. When I search for not your show name, which everyone gets excited when they search for their name and it shows up number 1 or 2, but the keywords. So, for example, podcasting and radio. Does Matt's The Sound Off podcast show up in a search for that? I'm pretty much guessing it's probably going to be quite low down because you don't have those words in the title. And so those are sort of tweaks that you can make that will then start surfacing your show for those specific search terms. It's just things like that. And the way that I do my audits is I say to people, look, I do a traffic light system, red, amber, green. Red and amber never mean bad. They just mean more opportunity to improve. That's the way I put it. There's no such thing as a good or a bad podcast in terms of how you're putting it out there. Yes, some sound better than others, but there's only such a thing as how we can improve this and make it even better.
Neil, thanks so much for doing this. Let us know exactly where we can get one of these audits.
So you can go to podnose.co.uk, and then if you click on the services tab, you'll be able to see it in there.
All right. Neil, thanks so much for doing this. And it's great to finally meet you for the first time just a couple weeks ago, and great to have you on the show.
It's been a pleasure, and I must return the favor someday and have you. When I start getting guests on the Podmastery show, I'll get you on that.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.